Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. We're going to be getting into materials this week. Today we're going to start off with just what I see as the 3 essential parts of making a realistic looking material, as well as how to import files to make a believable PBR material. And I'll get into what all that means in this lesson. So let's open up our Blender file. You can see I have my objects just kind of assembled in a little stylish setup. The first thing I want to do is actually to open up a new type of workspace. So we've been working just in the layout right now. It brings up the options when we need them, but we have other type of workspaces. So there's a modeling one that if you open that up, you can see it has the toolkit that opens up when we hit tab in the layout workspace. But now we're going to get into the ones for materials. So we have UV editing, texture paint, and then shading, which is the one we're going to be in today. So now we're going to actually be venturing into more workspaces they're all catered to what you're working with at that point. So for materials, let's work on our cupcake cake part. And you might notice that your models are like a whiter color now as compared to in layout they have that grayer kind of shading to them. So that's just determined by the viewport, how the viewport is being displayed to you. So we've seen wireframe before. This is just the simple shaded version. The one that your shading automatically opens is that third globe in that top right. So that's where these are all changing. And this is a material preview where it's putting in basically an image to act as the lighting. So it's just like a generic lighting to test out your materials, and then just as a pointer, the last little globe is going to be a more render preview. So this is how it would look if you actually rendered it. I mean, it's still a simpler version, but you will have the material reacting to the lighting will look differently between the pre-setup lighting and your viewport render, because the render right now it's only using this one light that we had in here as a default light. Where is it even? There he is. So this is our only light in our render, as opposed to the material preview. So I'm going to go into shading. It opens a few more menus that we haven't seen before. Top left is kind of self-explanatory. It has some folders from your computer that are going to show up here. Top left we're not going to get into yet, but we'll really mainly be using just the more normal viewport area, as well as that section below it. And this section is going to be where our materials are going to be more mapped out visually for us to work with. So first let's get a material on our cupcake. So to do that, we're going to also open up a new menu on that bottom right section of our screen. So we've looked at object properties, the modifiers, the data properties, but we also have down here in the red, that little red globe. I always call these globes, and I'm like, what are they actually trying to be? I think it's a globe. But this is our material properties. So what we have pulled up here is going to be redundant information to what's going to be in this graphed out area. But it's more depends on which you're more comfortable working with, but it will be a redundant information. So to actually add that material, you can hit this plus new button, and it's automatically going to create a material. So all this new information came up is the information about that material. You can see um, this little rectangle popped up in your graphed area. So this is, again, just all the information about the material as it exists right now. And you can see this one's called, for me it's called material 0.002 because I made a couple test materials and I didn't change their name, but since we're into naming things so we don't confuse ourselves or others, I'm going to name it cupcake. Actually, I'll do M for material. Cupcake, cup, cake. No, we're doing the cake part. To avoid confusion, I'll just name it like 3 different things. And the automatic material that came up is called the principled BSDF. If you click on this, it is going to give you different options of different shaders to use. So shader and material, I'll probably use this word interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing, but shader is specifically like the information about that material to define what it's going to be looking like. So there might become instances where you'll use something else, but the default one is the one we'll generally be using because it is a PBR material. And PBR materials, which stands for physically based rendering, is going to have the foundation for your material to basically function in whatever render engine you put this in. So Blender itself is going to have 2 different render engines or options. We'll get into that more when we actually cover rendering, but right now the render engine that's activated that is going to be like changing around easily while we're working with materials is the Eevee renderer. But even when we change it to a different renderer, the other one, it's going to treat the materials the same just because it's a PBR, so that just means it's based off of like physically based. So there are some materials that it's more just like made up information, so it's not going to work the same wherever you bring up your image. So principled BSDF is perfect. That's what we're going to be working with. And next class I'll be covering like all the different aspects of this because it has a lot of options in it for like to make a metal object, to make glass objects, to give you like more waxy, fleshy objects. But I just want to cover 3 of the sections here for today because these are the 3 that you should have on all of your objects. Like every single object, the bare minimum should have these 3 things altered to make it a realistic looking object or material. There will be cases where like further exploration of this menu will be needed to it to be fully realistic looking, but even like the most basic material should at least have these 3 things. So what I'm referring to is base color. So that's just going to be like the color of your object. The second thing is specular. So that's kind of covering these 3 sliders, the specular tint, and roughness. So specular is how light is reflecting off of your object. And then the final thing, once we play I Spy and find it, near the bottom is normal. And normal is going to be where it gets a little bit more confusing because we actually have to work with our nodes in here. But normal is going to actually give it a kind of texture so it looks like touchable, like it has a roughness or softness to it. And I'm going to do my best to not use texture when I mean material because they sometimes are like interchanged, but the texture usually is referring to something that's affecting your material to like give it a little bit more depth without actually modeling that depth. So let's start off with base color. And for that, we just can click on base color, and if you've worked with some other design programs, you can see we just can move this little dot around and determine what color we want our cupcake to be. So I'm gonna make mine like a red velvet cupcake. You can also alter the value of it, so lighter, darker value. Oh my god, what is a red velvet? There we go. Beautiful. So that one's pretty simple. For objects that are just a solid color, all you have to do is go into base color, pick that color out for you. There will be, in a bit, I'll like show if you had like a patterned, I conveniently just had this mouse near me, but if you had something that had stripes, I will show you like how you could do that by importing an image. Because most of your work is going to either be working with these sliders or importing images you find online and plugging them in to make your materials. So base color, number one. Number two, specular. And speculars, you're mostly going to only be dealing with the roughness slider. If you want to be like, if you're so into materials, you can be a little bit more exact with other aspects of these options here. But specular is how light is being reflected, how much light is being reflected off your object. So you can see 0, nothing is being reflected. It's all just being like absorbed into your cupcake. And then 1 is, it's not even all of it's being reflected, but the 0 to 1 values you can see is all it goes between, and this is what like the realistic amount would be. If you did want to try to stylize your renders a little bit, you could type in numbers past 1. So if you wanted like a really reflective cupcake as your style, you could go above 1. But most of your objects, you're just going to keep it at 0.5 because most materials are going to be hovering around like 0.48, 0.56, just like really close to that 0.5 mark. So it's not going to make too much of a difference just for the level we're at with our work. I will post a website where you can actually like look up what the specular value of specific materials would be. But again, most cases 0.5 is going to leave perfectly fine. Specular tint, you're only going to use this for metallic objects because most objects are reflecting that white light back off of them. But if you have like a blue metallic cup, it's going to be reflecting blue light back. So specular tint, only going to touch with metals. So the one thing we're actually going to touch for specular is roughness. And if we play around with this, if you drag it down to 0, so this is that like generic lighting I was mentioning where it's using an image to light our scene right now. So that's where these like magical trees just appeared from. And a 0 roughness means like there's a hard edge highlight of where that light is reflecting back, but as you increase that roughness, it kind of spreads it out more across that surface. And as you make your way up fully to 1, this is something like chalk where a lot of that light is actually being absorbed. So for roughness, you just kind of have to, this is where it's important to use a reference to kind of judge how reflective the material you're copying is. So if we pull up a little cupcake, little cupcake picture. Kind of offended. My Google like hasn't been trying to advertise cupcakes to me, even though I'm Googling them so much. So if we want our cupcake to look like nice and moist, it is a little bit reflective, but not so much that it looks like a vinyl cupcake, which is what that like 0 value looks like. So I might put mine here. I might alter it later on once I do the third step. So the final thing for like the bare minimum material is going to be your normals. And this is where I do want to clarify, normal is meaning it's using some kind of map to add like fake depth, basically, fake details to your object. So if we look at this example I have of Samus, this is her with just like specular and a base color, so just very basic colorful shapes as her armor. This middle image is what the normal map looks like. So it's usually like this weird mix of like neon colors like purple and greenish blue and hot pink. But the color is giving, in this case Blender, information of the direction that light is being reflected off of faces. So it's basically making like smaller faces from our meshes, fake small faces, to make it seem like it's a more detailed object than it really is. So this is the detailing of that normal map, and when it's placed on just like that basic mesh, you can see it looks a lot more detailed without actually modeling this. So these like divots in her armor hasn't actually been modeled, it's just coming from her normal map. So for something like our cupcake, right now we just have like this smooth surface, but if you actually look at one, you can see it has these little divots in it, and rather than having to go in and model this, we can put a normal map on. So that's like one clarification. Second clarification is there are basically 3 maps you're going to run into that do a very similar effect for this. So the normal map was what we were just looking at on Samus. It's this colorful map that does calculations of like how the light is being reflected, what direction it's being reflected off of those faces. So here's another example, the color, the normal map, and that's how it looks when you combine them and adds fake depth. So you're not actually like moving the stone out. It's all coming from just like shading that's happening from your normal map. So the second option of doing this like fake depth is a bump map. So this fancy tab here on the right is the normal map version. On the left side is our bump map version. So normal map and bump map are basically doing the exact same thing. They're adding that fake detailing, fake depth to your mesh, but the bump map is a black and white image. The normal map is that colorful image. Most cases you're going to be using the normal map just because it does provide a little bit more information of how light is interacting with your mesh, but there are cases where you might only find a bump map, and there's like default settings in Blender we're going to be working with today that will be bump maps. So just know that there are 2 different versions that do the exact same thing. So bump is the grayscale map, and then normal map is that neon party map. And now, more confusion. I'm like wondering if there's a better way to do this besides just dumping it all on you. There is a third map. So normal, bump. There's also a third one that's going to do something very similar to what these do, but it is different from them. So there's a displacement map. The displacement map are going to look like your bump map where it's a grayscale. But the displacement map, it's still doing that thing where it's adding depth, but in the displacement map, so with the word, it's actually like displacing your mesh. So it's changing your mesh to add detail. So as I lose my voice, if you had, oh my god, a displacement map on this like stone image, if you had like a black and white image grayscale as a displacement map and put it on, it would look at that map and actually move parts of your mesh out to add more depth to it. So the normal and the bump map, they're not changing your mesh in any way to add that depth. The displacement map does change your mesh. So on larger scale, things like a brick or stone wall, you'll probably be using a displacement map. But for something like our cupcake, we probably don't need to do this. But just know going forward, there are going to be like 3 very similar maps. Does this show us nicely? So this is a good example. So you can kind of see on this, the ball stays circular all through base, bump, and normal. But when you get to displacement, you can see it like actually adds some ridges and stuff. So that's actually changing the mesh itself. Okay, so now to actually apply it, we're going to be working with our nodes, mapping out our nodes. And in this screen, you can move around just like you do in your viewport. Zoom in and out. You can pan around with shift and holding in that mouse click. And then to add stuff, you're also doing the same as in your viewport where you hit shift A. And for just the like basic pre-made textures that Blender has, you're going to go to the texture section. You can play around with some of these to see what they all do, but for now we're just going to use the noise texture. And then left click to place it in here. So what we want to do is to connect this to our normal section, but most of these are all going to be bump maps. So first I have to just tell Blender how it's using this pre-made texture we have, this pre-made map. So this is a bump map. So if I hit shift A, and then under vector is where we're going to find most of our info for working with our normal maps. So we're going to be using more of these soon. But for now, we just need bump. So bump map, we can connect. We're like connecting the dots. So all these dots on all these rectangles are where you can input and output information. So the whole left side of your materials info is where you can input even more info to refine your material further. So I can connect this bump normal to normal. Nothing changed because I haven't actually connected that noise texture. And to make the noise texture work, you're going to connect that FAC gray dot to the height gray dot. And now you can see like this weird like watery glistening effect happen to my cupcake. So this is that basic noise texture within Blender. So if you're doing something like an orange peel or just like little bumps of paint or of leather, the noise texture will probably work pretty well for that. If you need to make alterations, like we most definitely will with this, we have a few different options we can play around with. We can play around with scale. So you can see if I scale it to the left, so a smaller number, that detailing looks larger on our cupcake. If I make that number bigger, it's making that, so it's kind of like inverse logic of what you might think. The bigger number is making the detail smaller, but it's really meaning that it's piling more of those noise texture maps with each other. So more maps means smaller details or smaller scale. Now let's move on to detail. So this one, you can see left, it's more just like globby water. Move it to the right and it adds like a bunch of noise in there to fuzzy it up. So I'm probably not going to make this the most realistic looking cupcake for now, just because we are going to change it later on. And then we have roughness. You can see it kind of looks like it's doing something similar to detail, but it's like adding a little bit more depth. And the one last thing you might play with would be strength. So this is going to have a big effect and actually affect how realistic this is going to look. But this is basically saying like how far out it looks like that map is pushing from our mesh. So this looks like it has like weird big glumps on it. But if I decrease that strength, and these are not at good settings at all, but you can see it like starts giving it a more subtle, what did I like not do at a good ratio? It's looking like, I think that. So now we have this like nice kind of like basketball looking texture. And this is where you might like realize you need to play around with your roughness more, because this is like very reflective right here. So I probably want to make this a little bit rougher. But this will give you like a nice basic looking, like touchable cupcake pattern to it. And this is just from, again, just like the Shift A basic existing textures within Blender. If you want to be a little bit more specific with your normal maps, which I would encourage, you would find something online and import it. So that's what this section, the second part of class is going to be, is how to import images to make our materials.